Welcome back to Alley Chats. I'm your host, Rob Southgate. Alley Chats is like a virtual artist's alley featuring interviews with artists, filmmakers, podcasters, writers, and really any creative person you might find at a pop culture convention. My goal is to help draw attention to cool people and hopefully help them get some new fans. I want this podcast to raise up these amazing people and to inspire you, the listener, to chase your dreams as well. You can follow Alley Chats on Facebook under Alley Chats Podcast and join in the conversations. I'll add more social media in the future, but for now, that is the best place to interact with us. You can also email me directly if you would like to be a guest or have a guest suggestion. My email is rob@smgpods.com. Today I have an author with me. Anyone that listens to me knows it's probably a surprise to me because a lot of times people book and I don't know quite what we're going to talk about, but I'm really excited because also people that listen to me know that I talk to authors a lot. I love books and sci-fi books. You're in my wheelhouse, John. Today I have with me John Maly. And did I say that right, John?
You did, yes.
Excellent. So John is an author. He's got his first time book out. We're going to hear all about it. John, let's start out by tell people who you are and what you do.
All right. So I have worked, writing is a sort of more recently entered endeavor here. I always enjoyed writing from a young age, but I never really pursued it seriously. I was very focused, sort of single-mindedly so, on building the career that is my day job. And my day job is that I work in technology and law. Specifically, I work in support for litigation, and I do patent analysis where I analyze new inventions for companies to try to figure out who's using them and whether they're important and how much they're worth. And so I started out as a computer engineer and then took a few years off and education. And after like 5 years of working on a microprocessor design team, I went back to school for law. And that actually, strangely, is what kind of inspired this novel. Is there was this 1959 article from a Stanford Law Review edition that was talking about how you could you could phrase laws in mathematical equations. And instantly, like you could kind of see how it could be turned into software code. And so that was kind of what.
And it was 1959.
Yeah, that's what's really crazy is that the article. I was, when I went back to tell that story to my publisher, because she was curious as to like, hey, we should write up how you thought of this. I was thinking that article was from like 1970, but no, it was from 1959, which
that's crazy. Wow. Wow.
So that seemed like a cool idea, but it just sort of sat there on a dusty shelf in the back of my mind. And I'm sure probably a fair number of your listeners have a story like that, just sitting on the back shelf in a box that's like someday. And what unlocked that box for me finally was I took a short story class online, and it led you through all the steps of developing a short story. And then I took the short story and entered it into a nationwide sci-fi contest, and it was like a finalist. And so that kind of hooked me. And then I went back and took a online writing certificate program at Stanford. And this is a long time ago. This is like 10 years ago.
Okay.
And so that was really cool because for like 2 years, it was a baptism by fire for the premise in the story, where every new academic term was a new group of people willing to sort of give you this withering cross-examination of your story and whether it makes sense and everything else. And so that kind of led to when I finished the program, I continued working on it, and I had kind of a rough story outline, and then there were many more years of honing. So this whole thing has taken me like 10 years, which is, from a business perspective, probably not optimal. A novel every 10 years.
Yeah, because you don't make money until the third book usually. So you got a ways to go before you start making anything at this, right?
Yeah, I think about 2054, I think I should be in the black.
Oh, man. Well, hopefully I'll be alive to see it at that point. You never
Hopefully
know.
I'll be alive.
Yeah, right.
Forget you, man.
You know what I found is from talking to so many authors, a lot of times they'll say that first book 10 years is not an uncommon thing. It seems like there's an acceleration, a quickening that happens after that. Like once it gets out there and the juices are flowing, it's like, oh, maybe I'm going to start hammering away at this, and it seems to shorten. So I don't think we're going to wait another 20 years to finish a trilogy.
I think you and my publisher are on the same page and hoping that that's the case.
I'm not your publisher, am I? I'm not. I'm not. So the book is what a shocker that it has something to do with law. Juris Ex Machina.
Yeah.
Tell people now. Oh, we should also say this up front. Your book is coming out June 5th of this year, 2024. Is it going to be everywhere? Can they order it online? Where do you want people to buy it or pre-order it?
Yeah, it should pop up on June 5th. It'll be in electronic form and then trade softcover and then hardcover all on June 5th. But it'll also be in Barnes & Noble and Kobo and all those other vendors. So kind of whatever your preferred vendor is. But I think Amazon is the one that is sort of what we've been focusing on for the first few weeks of
Sure. So if it's on Amazon, then I'm sure there's a pre-order that they can go to stake their claim or at least get notified. And I know that on your website, you can also get notified about when it's coming. So
yeah, probably the website is probably the best for that, just because the soft cover and the hardcover have not yet popped up yet for pre-order.
Okay. So it's johnmaly.com, JOHNMALY.com. And on the front page here, on your landing page, subscribe to Load to be the first to know Juris Ex Machina becomes available. And I'm sure you'll have all the information there. And I highly recommend people jump in for that. So, John, what is Juris Ex Machina? I mean, you gave us a little bit, but what is it?
Sure. So Juris Ex Machina is the premise of it is that in the 22nd century, so maybe 100 to 150 years from now, we have an airtight system of justice, and human error has been removed from the equation. So computers and AIs have replaced jurors and judges, and somehow the main character, who's this lovable teenage kleptomaniac named Rainville, gets wrongfully convicted of mass murder, hundreds of people. And so he and his attorney have to figure out why. One of the problems with that is that he's stuck in a prison where it's kind of based loosely off the Lurigancho prison in Peru, which is this place where the prison doesn't have guards inside. The prisoners are given keys to their own cells, and they're expected to sort of self-organize. And so it's a very strange system of people who are criminally disorderly having to achieve some sort of spontaneous order in this environment. So he has to find a way to break out of there that no one's ever broken out of. And then his lawyer needs to, at the same time, figure out what's happened here and who's behind it. So it's a speculative legal thriller in a future where technology and justice have become completely intertwined. It's sort of a cross between fast-paced sci-fi, kind of like Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, something like that, and then like a John Grisham type legal thriller. And it looks not just at this futuristic scenario, but also alludes to some loopholes in various systems of human justice going back hundreds and thousands of years. So it's got this sort of anthropology thread running through it as well. But the real motivation to write it was just that I think the future is always closer than we think it is. And so we shouldn't wait to think about the future, particularly when it comes to AI, because I think if we wait until the genie's out of the bottle to worry about this stuff, we're going to have a lot less control over how it turns out.
Big conversation going on right now, so it's really, really timely. This all sounds amazing to me. Everything you were saying, from the prison to the history to the jury and everything, it's just, this is a book I'm going to want to read. I'm a big sci-fi fan. So who would you say of the sci-fi writers, because obviously you chose sci-fi because you enjoy sci-fi, who would you say are your biggest inspirations?
It's a good question. I mean, I think Neil Stephenson was an early one. He was, I think Snow Crash was the first novel I read as an adult, like after I had finished school, and kind of like you were talking about on a recent episode with kind of losing brain cells going through academic programs. I went through 4 of those and just lost such, you get to the point where you're reading because you have a responsibility to read, and it ends up that the pile of books on your nightstand becomes not things you've chosen, but things you have to kind of step through. So that was kind of a reintroduction to sci-fi and kind of how engaging it could be. So that was definitely a motivation. When I started writing the book in earnest, I was reading Charles Dickens. I was reading Bleak House.
Oh, wow. Good call.
So that kind of motivated one of the characters because that's all about this like endless legal struggle.
Yeah. Ooh, now you're piquing me even further. This is cool.
Yeah, so those were big influences like kind of early on, and I don't know, the story really just started telling itself after a while. Once I hit a certain point, it just kind of spoke to me and was really clear what
Sure.
happened, which was surprising because it wasn't necessarily what I set out to write in the first place.
Sure. Oh, that's fascinating. So, it's funny you mentioned Dickens. When I talk to authors and I ask a question like that, very often they stay in the lane. They don't always, but very often they do. So it would be, I was expecting you to say, oh, well, of course, three body problem. And because it's, you know, current, currently very popular and, Asimov, but uh, Dickens is one of those that I'm really glad you said people don't realize he was really, I mean, he was almost science fiction. He was horror. He was like a genre writer that was super popular then. And it's interesting how you can draw from him now, and Bleak House, what a great book. Not one
Well,
that people mention usually either.
yeah, and it sort of has interesting parallels, I feel like, to a lot of our modern science fiction and how it's fed to us, right? Through these like limited series or maybe not limited series on, Netflix or something like that. And Bleak House was interesting because if I'm remembering correctly, and it's been a while, but I recall that being a serial novel that he would publish
I
a
believe that's true.
chapter through like a newspaper every.
It's how he introduced Christmas Carol too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that and it's challenging. You can only imagine because you read through now, and I think this was much more tolerated in novels of that era, where a character will be introduced, and then two chapters later, you'll never hear from that character again, and you'll be like, "Why was that guy here?"
Yeah, right, right.
So it's challenging, right? Because he has no idea how the story is going to end necessarily, but he's got to keep writing every week, a chapter a week, and hopefully circle back and complete these thematic arcs and plot arcs.
Yeah, Stephen King experimented with that with Green Mile and what was the other one?
Oh, really? I didn't know that
Yeah,
about Green Mile.
when
Hmm.
Green Mile came out, I think it was once a month, and we'd go into the store and there were these little paperbacks, and you
Wow.
waited, so you'd get it and you'd be reading it and you'd be like, "Oh my God, what's going to happen next?" And it wasn't until much later that it was collected. Um,
That's such
I
a great
have
story too.
on our oh yeah, and that was one where I did feel that way because you were getting introduced to inmates that you might kind of get really interested in, and he moved on. you know and with our podcast network we had, I'm going to give a plug here. uh One of our podcasters is a science fiction writer, and he did the same thing. His book 10,000 Dawns, he did it chapter by chapter, once a week released a chapter. Okay. And the way he released it was, rather than put it out in the universe that way, he wrote it. Then we released the podcast of him reading the chapter, and then you could buy the chapter. So at the end of it, he had a complete audiobook
Wow.
first, and then the book came out, and now it's gone on to he's done a lot with it. He just wrote a big anniversary edition that expanded on it, but in the beginning it was this chapter by chapter by chapter.
That's great. That's
Yeah,
really
it's a really interesting experiment, right?
it is. Yeah, that's it's a tough genre, and I think that's a really fun way to do it in that, the diehard fans have to listen to the reading and then later on, it's almost like a comic, right? Like later
Yes.
it's compiled into this nice glossy covered graphic novel, but initially you need to do some work to follow it.
Yeah, I remember as a kid getting the weeklies, the floppies. And you'd sit there, and I'd have my little stack that I bought each week, and I'd lay on my parents' bed and read them because their bed was more comfortable. And I'd read them, and then you get to the end, and you're like, or you get the next week, and you're like, what? I'm trying to remember what happened in Daredevil last month. I'm trying to remember because you'd wait a month to see the next book. And it was quite a thought experiment every time to try to go back and remember, you know?
Yeah, graphic novels were like the early sort of binge watching because you could just go
Oh
through the
yeah.
entire thing in one neat package.
Yeah, I remember getting The Watchmen, the original series, that way, and then going back and rereading it as the graphic novel, and it was totally felt like a binge watch, which we didn't have a phrase for that back then. Okay, so Juris Ex Machina, is this a, you might not be able to answer this. In your vision, is this a one-off and you move on to the next book? Is this part of a series? I mentioned a trilogy, but I was just speculating. What are you thinking with this?
Well, so I started writing this back in a while ago, like 2011, 2012. And, at the time it didn't find a publisher right away because AI was such a forward-looking thing at the time. It wasn't, the situation we're in now where it's just sort of got its tentacles into
Everywhere. Yeah.
every app, everything. And it's not in some opt-outable way. Like it's just integrated. Like if you buy a new car, it's going to be integrated in some way with the features of that car. So I think since I started focusing on this, and then I also have the work aspect, right? Like my day job, I'm doing expert witness work on some pretty sophisticated AIs that have been written by these Fortune 500 tech companies, and that kind of forced me to follow AI development a lot more closely and really make sure I was on the cutting edge of it for work. And that has just given me so many more ideas as to like what the next logical like kind of contention or stress point there's going to be between AIs and humans following what happens in this novel. So I am definitely hard at work at a sequel already.
Oh, very good to hear. You're hooking me in further here. So, it's funny. I'm also what you were just saying reminds me of when William Gibson first kind of everybody started reading William Gibson, and he was talking about the internet and all that. And it was like, yeah, we knew that this was out there, but he was looking 10, 20 years in the future of it. And it was like your mind was blown. Now you look at it and you're like, yeah, of course it all happens. So I'm walking around with the internet in my phone, my pocket all day. I have a phone that I walk around with, which back then that was just speculation. And
Yeah.
I think that AI is that same Wild West right now, where people have a lot of thoughts. There's a lot of fear around it, but going into a story that's having to deal with some of that minutia of like the legality, that sounds very intriguing.
Well, it's interesting you say that because like you look at the distance between the number of years between William Gibson and Neuromancer, for instance, and something like Ready Player One. And Ready Player One was, this smooth, polished way to envision the metaverse.
Yeah,
And I think that with AI, there's just the, not the same thing as singularity with AIs, but if you actually look at the plot of, or like plot the graph of how drastically and rapidly AI is evolving, and every day there's some new application that you never would have really thought of to
right.
use AI in this capacity, anything from crime to music. And
Absolutely.
that I think is what makes it such an interesting thing to think about. And it's an interesting and sort of dangerous thing to use as what you're, the space for your writing, because it's just, there's so many unknowns. It becomes much more challenging, but also more exciting to try to envision the future.
Yeah, you don't want your futuristic book to be the past a year from now because yeah, we're so far past that. What's he doing?
That's that's one thing. So I've started working on a fantasy novel just these last couple of years, and it occurs to me that the beauty of fantasy is that like people will still be reading like a Tolkien novel like 2 centuries from now, and it
Right.
will be just as relatable, possibly even more relatable than it was in the 1930s or 40s. And sci-fi, yeah, like you write it and it's cool and futuristic and inspiring for 50 years maybe, and then now it's quaint and
Right. Yeah, it's like
anachronistic.
Jules Verne writing about the first men on the moon, and like when people read that, it was mind-blowing
Yeah,
sci-fi, and now you look at it and you're like, that's all silly. It's
yeah,
fun. It's a
and
great book, but it's
and
silly.
as far as like the genres, I think they're both can be equally useful because what I find fascinating, right? So part of my background educationally is in psychology, and I think what is really fascinating specifically about sci-fi and fantasy is that you can get at these really strange corner cases of how the human condition and how humans will react under really strange corner cases of, you know, everything from what if we were able to live forever? What if money didn't matter? Like all these different things you can kind of see what humans would do in response. And it's so easy to get at those things versus, if you're running like Hemingway about some guy who gets kind of adrift while he's fishing, it's like it's harder to get at the human condition. But I think
Right.
they're both really good for that.
I agree with you. In fact, it's funny. It's so funny that you mentioned science fiction and fantasy because I'm a big genre reader. I read all sorts of things, but I love science fiction. I mean, love it. Philip K. Dick and Theodore Sturgeon and Harlan Ellison. These are my guys, right?
Yeah.
I love horror, and I've got a ton of those, and then I've got a lot of sci-fi or fantasy as well. And it's funny that you mentioned it that way because the best of it reveals our human condition. It's easier to say, here's what's happening now, and here's who we are right now. The speculative stuff, when it's done right, it still reveals the human condition that's ancient. When fantasy is done right, it reveals the human condition. I'm reading Shannara right now, and as I'm reading Shannara, I'm not only am I seeing the parallels to Lord of the Rings, but I'm also seeing modern day reflected in it so strongly. And you go, wow, like this is orcs and gnomes and arrows, and yeah, it it hits it. It talks about us now. And science fiction does the same thing. There's a Theodore Sturgeon story called Case and Dreamer that I've never mentioned on this show, but it's one of those that stays with me every day of my life. It just is there. And when we talk AI and we talk uh, even things like exploration, when you think about like somebody like Magellan, this story that takes place 300 years in the future, Magellan is still in it. It's like it's so interesting to me how these all mesh. It's just like you talked about psychology. Horror has the same effect. It gets to a certain part in us.
Oh,
There
definitely. Yeah.
there's the hey, we're gonna cut a head off and blah blah blah. And you go, okay, great, slasher, whatever. But the horror that really gets me does what you're talking about. It makes you think. It stays prescient. It's showing us who we are, which I love so much.
Well, yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about how genre fiction for such a long time was kind of, second class, like backseat
Right.
sort of like, and and yet I think you see the I mean, one of the important functions of literature is to expose some clarity into the very opaque, foggy mess that is human nature
Right.
and
Right.
condition. And when you see some story that involves like dwarves and elves and all this stuff, and yet gives you so much sort of, I don't know, like it's so introspective in the human condition. And like even simplifying even more, like you look at like The Little Prince. I remember having to read that in like eighth or ninth grade French class in like the original French because all the sentences are so short. It's like
Right.
perfect
Right.
for French class. And I was reading through this, and I thought it was like this little kid's book. And as this teenager, I'm reading through it, and I'm like, wow, like he goes to this planet, and there's only one thing on this planet, and it's a flower, and like
Yeah.
how he relates to this is like this really deep. You start to realize it's all deep and philosophical. And
Yeah.
so I almost think that, yeah, like this is a genre that lets us kind of go a lot farther off the road and explore the wilds surrounding how humans behave than a more conventional drama.
Well, and it feels like it almost bores deeper, at
Yeah.
least for me. One of the reasons I'll find myself so emotionally invested. And that doesn't mean that traditional literature, any of that doesn't do the same thing, but it's so interesting to me how uh sci-fi fantasy was kind of the redheaded stepchild forever. Jules Verne didn't get the respect till much later. William Goldman, is that his name? With Lord of the Flies was able to break through, but when you get to the heart of that, that's a horror novel, and
Mhm.
it's almost bordering on science fiction. And it's interesting because he's literature, but it's like, wow, you tapped into something so deep that I think if it had been Bob's Coffee Shop and the people in the coffee shop, it might not have resonated quite the same way. Now I say that I'm like, ooh, I want to read a Lord of the Flies in a coffee shop. That sounds awesome. What happens after hours? It turns into Lord of the Flies over the espresso machine. Uh,
It's kind of like
So
Hunger Games, right? That's like the same like
yes,
facet of yeah.
yeah, which she hit that perfectly on the head, right? Because when I don't know if you read it the way I read it, I was in the middle of my bachelor's program. And as we said, my brain was turning to mush. It was so much. And I had stopped reading, and I was always a voracious reader. And then somebody that I worked with said, "Oh, you got to read this. It's really great." And I read the first one, and 2 days later, I bought the second one, and 2 days later, I bought the third one, and was like, I can't get enough of this. And then my whole world, I'm looking at it like from this YA novel, it exposed all these things.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Wonderful. Did you see the now I haven't heard great things about the book, but did you see the latest movie from that series?
I'm not
The
sure if I saw the last.
snakes, and it's a new one.
Oh no,
It's
I have not. No.
see the movie. We
Yeah.
didn't know what to expect. We're like, oh, this will be okay. Nope. It's phenomenal. My whole family just was like, this is a fantastic movie. And we're movie and book snobs. So
Mm.
okay, John, we're almost at the end here. I'm gonna ask you another question, but before we get to that, I'm gonna say it again. It comes out June 5th of this year. Pre-order this book if you can. Otherwise, June 5th, mark it on your calendar. Tell your sci-fi friends Juris Ex Machina by John W. Maly, Maly. You want to pick up this book. I know I'm going to be standing right there in line in my Juris Ex Machina cosplay. My joke fell flat because I stumbled over my words. Uh, uh, so, okay, John, here's the big question. You chose to be on Alley Chat, so you have to answer this one. This is your ultimate convention, whatever this means to you. Okay. Who is it that you would just die to meet?
Does it have to be someone who's living?
Did I not say it's your rules? It is
Oh,
your rules, living, dead. I think fictional would be a little weird, but who knows?
I went to a MegaCon that was the very last year that Stan Lee was alive.
Ah,
And we were walking through, down the tables and we saw Stan Lee and we were just like, oh my God, it's Stan Lee. Like
right,
he's right
right.
over there. And my buddy was like, hey, should we go talk to him? And I said, wait, let's go over to the actual like, vintage comic book booth and let's buy like some really cool early, version of something for him to sign.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so we got kind of fixated on that. And then we ended up stopping to have a lunch. And then we came back and he was gone.
Uh,
And so we never were able to do it. And then he passed away like later that year. And I would have loved to go up and just, talk to him and thank him. And
Thank you, Stan.
yeah,
Why are you
this would be
talking to that voice? I'm fangirling. I can't help it. You're
that's what I would have sounded
awesome.
like. So,
Yeah.
so maybe now I don't have the same, like I've got more serious regrets with gravitas instead of like, oh my God, I can't believe I told Stan that.
You would have walked up and yeah, right. Because if you had talked to him, the regret would be, I walked up and I turned into that Chris Farley character. Remember when you wrote Iron Man? That was awesome. Remember when
That's
you
right.
wrote Fantastic Four? That was awesome. And he's like, okay, kid, move along. I have a similar story. I don't usually share this part, but just before he died, we were at it was either C2E2 or Wizard World in Chicago, and I had a somebody with me, and he stopped at a booth because there was this comics or whatever, and he's like, oh no, I just want to look. I was like, yeah, but Stan Lee is signing. It would be cool to meet Stan Lee. And he's like, oh my God, Stan Lee. He goes, wait, just let me look here. And he started talking to somebody, and I went like this. I'm standing there, and I go, dude, we got to go. Stan Lee's going to be done any minute. And I pointed like this, like it's going to be right over here. And as I did this, Stan Lee walked within like 2 inches of my finger. Like I almost poked Stan Lee. And I got this glance like that, like he thought I was gonna like poke him. And then he walked by and I was like, holy crap, that was Stan Lee. And he goes, you scared him. And he died right after that. So maybe I hope I wasn't the cause. But yeah, I have such a similar story. It was so funny because that was my closest connection. I never saw him other than that.
Yeah. It
And I
was
have regrets because I almost poked him with a finger and I'm like, I might be the reason.
that could have been the conversational starter though. If you had actually made contact, you would have had to excuse yourself and say, sorry, I don't normally, just walk up and poke people in the face.
Then he's like, no, I've heard about you, kid. It was you.
We have a picture of you behind the tables, like we know to watch for you.
It just says, keep him away. Enough said. Oh, damn. Yeah, actually, I'm going to share one more. I'm going to bust a friend, and you're going to appreciate this. Talk about regrets. My friend, who is a huge Marvel fan, and I'm not going to say his name because people on the show would actually know who I'm talking about, because he's on podcasts that I do, but he's a huge Marvel fan, huge Stan Lee fan. He got to meet Stan Lee, and they paid the big money to get a picture. This was back when it was really the big money for Stan Lee. It's like towards the end of his life. And my friend, the day of the con, woke up with Bell's palsy, half his face.
Oh, no.
So this picture is of him beaming on one side, and the other side is okay.
Oh, no.
And Stanley is sitting there kind of looking like, what the hell? So my poor friend is like, the one time I meet him and I look like this. So the mean thing I do is I occasionally send him memes, and my best one of him, my best one was that picture. And then I put Two-Face on the one side. And I was like, hey kid, you're asking the wrong guy to sign this. And he's like, I hate you so much.
Wow. Yeah. You almost have to do some sort of a profile kind of a composition for that particular picture.
Yeah. So
there's no way you can go back and change that. It's
no. And he died right after that. It was actually the same con where I almost poked Stan.
That's great.
So funny. All right, everybody, go order Juris Ex Machina. It sounds like a phenomenal book. It's going to be on my bookshelf. I can't wait to read this. John, thank you so much for joining me. Tell everybody where they can interact with you on social media.
So I am on most of the networks, just about all of them. But I would say probably if your preference is TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, those are sort of probably the most central three. And it's just John Maly. I think there's an underscore and a W in between, but all the links are found on my website. You made it easy.
And I'm going to put all the links in the show notes too. So his website, my show notes, you'll get all the links. It'll cover everything. Your publicist will be thrilled. We're getting it everywhere, right?
We appreciate that, Rob. Thank you.
John, this was lovely. Thank you so much for joining me. And everybody, buy his book. Go meet him at something and get it signed. And if you have a patent you want to float by him, he does know a few things about patent law.
It's true.
Thanks again, John.
Okay. Thanks, Rob. It was a great time.
You can connect with me on social media or via email. All the links are found in the show notes. Oh, and it would really help me if you would rate and review this show on whatever platform you use to listen to this podcast. Good reviews help others find the show, which ultimately helps these incredible guests get more exposure. Alley Chats is a production of Southgate Media Group, hosted, produced, and edited by me, Rob Southgate. Thanks again for listening to Alley Chats. And don't forget to support